Coming off the success of Neversoft's Spider-Man, the hero was in a great position for a sequel game. However, this time around it would be developed by Vicarious Visions and not Neversoft. Would Vicarious Visions be able to replicate the same type of experience from the original game? Would they be able to make the necessary upgrades to make this sequel better than the first? We would soon find out. We pick up shortly after the events of the first Spider-Man, where we defeated Doc Ock and the other villains, saving everyone in the city from being turned into symbiotes. Electro has been orchestrating a series of robberies across New York City, and it's up to us to investigate why. The first thing I noticed regarding the story was how alone Spider-Man was. Even though we encountered different villains during every mission, it just felt like we had no backup or help at any time. In the original game, right from the start, we had Black Cat by our side. And even when we were separated from her, it still felt like we weren't alone, due to the inclusion of other heroes like Daredevil, Captain America, etc. As we got deeper into the plot, I found myself saying, where is my help? Where are the other heroes? I understand that the game needed to show off other characters that weren't in the first, but it just felt like there were a lot of villains and not enough heroes. Now I know that the heroes wouldn't have helped us much in a fight, but it's still nice to see Spider-Man interact with others that weren't just villains. The banter between the heroes helped ease the tension and not make every single scene so serious, so the lack of other heroes was definitely missed. The plot for this game was original, but not too boring that it would struggle to keep your attention. Pretty much Electro's main plan is to acquire the BioNexus device, the device that would enhance his powers and make him almost unstoppable. He pretty much wanted the device that Electro had in Spider-Man No Way Home. If you know, you know. Over the course of the story, we fight different villains than the first game, which included Shocker, Hammerhead, Sandman, and the Lizard, with all but the Lizard working with Electro against Spider-Man. What I will give this game credit for is how they introduced the villains from mission to mission. For example, after defeating Sandman for the first time, we hop on a train only to run into the Beetle, who escapes with a briefcase. To just come off a boss fight and then be introduced to another villain immediately was really well done. It wasn't in your face, but just having him appear on the train was just subtle enough to surprise me a bit. Each mission you go through felt like a small piece of the puzzle, as after completing the objective, another small layer of the story was peeled back, and we learned a little bit more about what was going on. Even still, the story was missing some actual emotion. It wasn't until the end fight with Electro that I actually felt something. Now don't get me wrong, I wasn't expecting a whole lot since this game is 22 years old, but it just lacked some sort of emotion. The first game had a serious yet comedic tone that was made apparent from the very beginning. However, in this game, it was just all seriousness right from the start. The devs tried to add some comedic elements with the Daily Bugle newspapers that would appear at the start of every mission, but it didn't hit the same. Spider-Man always has his punchlines and quirky jokes, but those only go so far when he's not surrounded by other heroes to bounce those off of. The villains aren't the brightest, so they just accept whatever insults he throws at them like it was no big deal. The lack of emotion doesn't hinder the game dramatically, it's just something I noticed by the end of my playthrough. I don't think the story for this game is bad, as Electro's motivations were clear and it makes sense why he would want the device, but it just didn't hit the same as the first game. The villains in this game were all pawns used by Electro to further his own goal, but they didn't really have any reason of their own to try and kill Spider-Man. Like in the first game, we fight Scorpion, who is trying to kill Jameson but is also working for Doc Ock. We know Scorpion hates Spider-Man, but what other reason do we have to fight him? His hatred for Jameson justifies that reason. Overall, I thought this story was decent but not better than the first. It just felt like the devs wanted to use a group of different villains in this game but couldn't decide a good reason for all of them to work together in the first place. In addition, having Electro be the leader of this group just felt a little off. In my opinion, Electro always felt like a top henchman type villain, never the leader of an actual group. I didn't think Electro was portrayed badly, but I wasn't a fan of his role in this particular scenario. Nonetheless, this story is worth going through once, especially if you were a fan of the first game. The gameplay is the aspect of this game that changed the most from its predecessor. To start off with, you can finally play on the ground. No longer we have fog covering the streets of New York City as we traverse various locations with the ability to fight in the city streets. Now, even though the streets are open, the streets are only long hallways that eventually have invisible barriers that prevent you from going forward. I wasn't expecting any more than this considering this was a PlayStation 1 game, but just being able to be on the streets felt great. Who knew that something so simple could make this much of a difference? A big difference from the first game is that Beast from X-Men guides you through the tutorial versus Black Cat. In addition, the tutorial for this game isn't as in-depth as before. It's like the devs assume that if you're playing this game, then you played the original and didn't need as much of a tutorial. I would say that if you're going to play this game for the first time, then I would go straight to the training mode first and learn all the mechanics of the game, because there are missions where you need to perform certain movements that you aren't shown during the initial tutorial. Once you complete the training, then start up the story. Some new additions to the game were the different enemy types. The original had a couple enemy variations, but this game really took it to another level. Depending on the level, we had to fight gangsters, robots, drones, mercenaries, and of course, the main villains. This added more variety to each level, helping them feel unique instead of just fighting the same enemy no matter the location. Some of these enemies are really annoying, but not because they were difficult to kill, but because of the game itself. Let me explain. There is a mission where you have to infiltrate this highly guarded base where there are tons of traps and drones. The drones are easy to kill but are small and fly around constantly. This wouldn't be a big deal if the camera wasn't absolutely terrible. If you weren't aware, the camera turns based on which way Spider-Man is facing. So if your enemy comes from the north but you're facing the south, you can't just adjust the camera to destroy the enemy unless you quickly turn Spider-Man in that specific direction. When you have multiple drones you need to kill, and if you don't kill them they destroy generators, ending the mission, it gets really frustrating. The camera in both games is so bad, but the level design of this game really brings this issue up front and center. There are many times where you need to go up somewhere or find something, and the camera makes all of that difficult to do. On top of that, having multiple enemies attacking you proves to be a real challenge, as you have to constantly turn the camera in each direction to face the enemy so you can attack it. It's no problem when you have enemies that are more stationary, but for those enemies that move constantly like the drones, it's infuriating. If there was one thing that needed to be overhauled and wasn't, it was the camera. The level design for this game is so much worse than before. I see the vision the devs were going for, as the levels themselves are larger in scale and incorporate more into each mission, making them longer in length. But too many times I found myself unsure of what to do next. I understand that games years ago didn't hold your hand and tell you what to do or where to go, but sometimes Peter would just make a statement and that was it. After he said that sentence, you just gotta figure it out. Like this, for example.
This place is gigantic. From the looks of all this electricity around me, this must be the main power conduit for all of biotech.
Now, after crawling all over the walls and jumping from platform to platform, I just happened to look up and find a small crevice where the first switch was. If a switch was going to be hidden way up there, then why didn't we have the spider compass to help point us in the right direction? This is just one of many examples where it's kinda ambiguous and left open pertaining to what exactly you needed to do to complete the mission. It's clear that the devs wanted to make each level more expansive, and I think they achieved this, as there are more puzzles, enemies, and platforming in this game than the first, but it's how they're implemented that's the problem. To put it simply, I think that what the devs were trying to achieve was too ambitious for the PS1. I could see what they were trying to do in each mission, but I don't think it was fleshed out enough to make it flow well on the current gen systems. The idea for these missions were great, but the execution was flawed. The boss fights required more thinking and skill than before, as in order to defeat each boss, you had to perform certain actions that would make each fight easier. Like in the second Sandman fight, you had to turn the valve and increase the water pressure so the water would explode so you could trap Sandman in the water and inflict damage. These fights were a lot more thought out and made you think a bit more than before. You can't just run up to the enemy and just hit away without getting hit with some counterattack because you didn't think about what to do for the actual fight itself. Unfortunately, knowing what to do to defeat the boss is ambiguous just like the levels themselves, and in order to figure it out, you just gotta try different things. Like in the final fight against Electro, you can see that you need to disable his device, but how do you do that? The game doesn't give you any hints, you just have to listen to what Peter says and put the pieces together. That fight is easily the best fight in the game, by the way. Nonetheless, the boss fights were definitely improved and fit what was going on within the story. The gameplay for this game is definitely improved from the first one, but the camera issues alongside the poor level design hinders the gameplay experience. It makes the game much harder to play than it actually is. I admire the ambition the devs had when creating the game, but the final result just didn't live up to what it could have been. Just like the original, there is plenty of side content to keep you busy after finishing the main story. As I mentioned earlier, there is the training mode where you can learn everything you need to know about the mechanics of the game. There's a costume section like before, but this time there's different costumes, like Venom 2 Earth X, Negative Zone, and others, giving you more suits for future replays. New to this game is a feature called Create a Spider, where you could create your own Spider-Man with his own skin plus various powers. This was a cool feature as you could craft a Spider-Man that suits your specific style of gameplay or how you wanted to play the game. Again, there is a character viewer, where you can see all the characters that appear in the game, narrated by Stan Lee, just like in the original.
Fugitive William Baker hid from the law in an atomic test range where a freak accident turned him into the Sandman. Once a two-bit thug until he had an adamantium plate implanted in his head, Hammerhead now rules the Mafia with an iron hand.
The comic book covers return as well, but this time with new comic covers from Peter Parker's journey as Spider-Man. If you unlock all of them, you can see that number 23, The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, 2001 Annual, was the cover for the first game. Seeing this cover was a nice nod to the first, but could easily be missed if you don't unlock the cover. The Parker Portfolio section contains pictures of the boss fights that occur during the story. They're nothing over the top, but it's nice art to look at. And finally, you can still enter cheat codes just like in the original. I really wish cheats would come back in games today, even if they're just for vanity items or gameplay effects. Cheats really helped improve the replay value with some of these older titles. Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro is a sequel that tried to do a lot of things, some done well, others not so much. Regardless, it takes the foundation that was created from the first and improves upon it, making for a fresh but familiar experience that all Spider-Man fans will enjoy. Even with the drawbacks with the camera and level design, this game is still worth a playthrough. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7 out of 10. This game is fun, but misses the mark in some areas and doesn't hold the same charm as the original one does. Playing this game decades later after its release has shown me why this game gets overshadowed by the first. Unfortunately, I think this is one of those rare cases where the original game is better than the sequel. What did you think about Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro? Did you play this game when you were a kid, or are you just hearing about this for the first time? Let me know your thoughts about the game in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to drop a like or subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.